How well you measure what you claim to measure, how well you create the variables that you said you were going to make, right? So both independent variables and dependent variables. So what was the independent variable in this study? Instructional condition. And how many levels did it have? Two. And what were they?
Experimental and standard.
Okay, we had the experimental and the control, right? Tell me about the experimental condition. What did they do in the experimental condition that made it experimental? Created their own research. Okay, that's part of it. When you say created their own research, what does that mean?
Designed their own study.
Okay. So the experimental group designed studies. Okay, but so did the control group. Control group designed studies. So the control group designed studies too. What did they do in the experimental group that was experimental? They conducted a study. Okay, what else? So they actually not only designed a study, but actually did it, right? Gathered the data, did analysis. What else did they do that made the experimental group different? I mean, if that was it, why do they have four paragraphs? They read an article. What, one article for the whole? Okay, so for every type of design, they read peer-reviewed articles. Okay, what else did they do?
Teacher used scaffolding.
Teacher used scaffolding. What's scaffolding?
It's harder as it goes along. Remove support as they go along to make them.
Okay, so you start off giving the students lots and lots of support, and then as they get more practice, the instructor gives them more and more independence, right? Or another way to think of it is more and more responsibility to make the choices. So they read articles about each thing. What else did they do? They also talked about writing. What did they do with regard to writing in the experimental condition that was different?
They did a bunch of writing activities throughout the
They did writing activities throughout the semester, right? When they would read an article, then they would summarize it. Then they would talk about the article in class. Then they would talk about an experiment, coming up with an experiment like with the one that was in the article. And then they would actually try and do it. With the professor modeling what they should do first, and then through the course of the semester, letting the students take more and more leadership in making those design decisions. So do you think that this approach, what they did, creates something truly distinct from the experience the control group had? Did they effectively create something truly unique, something new, something, I mean, did they make a clear distinction between the two groups?
Yeah, they had examples to go by. Like the other ones were just reading.
Okay, so up here, all the control group and the experimental group both read the chapter, went to class, and probably had a lecture. But what the experimental group did after that was pretty different. Right? Everybody, they would design a study, but there was never any in-class design demonstration. They didn't conduct any studies. Right? So, what is your impression? Does this independent variable of instructional condition create two clearly delineated different groups that are really tapping in? I mean, does this seem really experimental? Does it seem new and different? Does this seem very standard treatment control-y to you? Does that sound a lot like lots of classes you've had? Read the book, go to lecture, take a test. That's it? Does that sound pretty standard treatment control-y to you? Unfortunately? Yeah, it's pretty standard treatment control. Okay, so what does that mean for the construct validity of this variable? Is it good?
Yeah, it's a good choice.
Do you think they did a good job of creating the groups they thought they were going to create? Of doing something truly experimental and distinct and making a standard treatment control that was pretty standard in its treatment? What about the dependent variables? Here they have one independent variable. Like, how many dependent variables did they have? Like 8? How do you know? How can you tell how many they had? Because there's a table where they talk about them. Right? Okay? So they had lots of different dependent variables. What kinds of variables are these? I mean, they're dependent variables, obviously, but what kind of thing are they measuring? Attitudes, perceptions, beliefs. How do they measure those things? They ask them about all this different stuff. How specifically did they get access to the students' attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions? What did they do?
It was a questionnaire. Was it like what, Likert scale type questions? Like,
Okay, go ahead.
to measure their attitudes toward. Yeah, there you go. The Likert scale.
That's a Likert scale. Okay, so they use Likert scale questions. What kind of scale is a Likert scale? Is that a nominal scale, ordinal scale, interval scale, ratio scale?
Ordinal?
Yeah, what's an ordinal scale? You say ordinal? Is that upward intonation? Like, I'm not sure. What's an ordinal scale?
You know there's a difference between the numbers, but you don't know how much.
Right. So there's the order. The numbers represent order, not a clear value. Right? So we know, for example, that strongly agree is more than agree, but we don't know how different strongly agree is from agree. We also don't know if one student strongly agree is the same as another student strongly agree. One student strongly agree could be another student's agree, right? They could be having the same internal experience and label it a different way. Okay. So, is that an appropriate way to access attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs? Is that a reasonable way to do it? Is there another way you could do it?
Open-ended questions, but then you would be able to get the kind of data.
Open-ended questions then have to be evaluated, right? You could do open-ended questions, but then they'd have to come up with some way to code the data for the same kind of thing, right? Like how many times did they say, I love it, or I feel so confident, or whatever, right? Okay, so they could have used an open-ended question. What does it mean that this citation is right here as they describe that survey?
Oh, is that where they got the questionnaire from? Is that where they got the questionnaire from?
Is that what that would mean to you if you were reading that and you saw that there was a citation after they described the survey? What would it suggest to you? That's been used before. Okay, so they didn't just create the questions on their own. What'd they do? They used questions that had been generated for a previous study of some kind. And this is a published study. So that suggests that it's a study that's been through peer review, which means other psychology or teaching professionals may have seen this before and thought that it was good and it got published. So they're using something that has been used before, which is not a bad idea. Because if you're going to be using a survey, it's always nice to use one that you're confident that actually works, or you have evidence actually works. Now, if you take a look at this, look at the authors. Who are the authors? Sizemore and Lewandowski. Either those names look familiar? second author is Lewandowski. Okay? What does that mean?
He's probably done this study similar to this before.
Okay, so
Probably
it
very
suggests
interested
that
in the subject matter.
Dr. Lewandowski has done stuff like this before, presuming that it's the same Lewandowski. How could you check?
By looking up the
You just gotta go look at the end of the paper, right? Go look at the reference and see, are the initials the same? Let's look. Okay. Lewandowski, G.W. Jr., Lewandowski, G.W. Jr. Look like it's the same person? Okay, so that suggests that this person has published multiple studies on this kind of thing before. And interesting things like learning may not equal liking, how a course in research and statistics changes knowledge but not attitudes, lesson learned using clinical examples for teaching research methods, right? Okay, so here's somebody who's published multiple times on this topic, is continuing to have publication success on this topic. So how does that make you feel about the use of that survey to measure their dependent variable or to generate data? Good?
Yeah, it's been approved a couple times.
It's been tested, at least it's been evaluated by others on probably a couple of occasions. Okay, so that's a good sign. Is there potential for any bias here?
probably.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a researcher and this is your area and you develop some materials, what materials are you going to use in your future research? Your stuff, right? Because then you're citing yourself. So it's great when you use materials, typically, well, I won't say it's great all the time, but it's very often a good thing to use materials that have been previously published, previously tested, previously evaluated by others when you are gathering data. But you also want to be thoughtful. Are you using materials that you developed because they're the best materials or because they're your materials? And maybe it's a little bit of both, right? It doesn't mean that just because you use your stuff that it's not good stuff. It could be the only stuff that's really out there, and what you're doing is saying, well, you know, unless you've got some better idea, I'm going to keep using my stuff. Because at least I have something that I've shown multiple cases works. We seem to be getting reasonable results. So I'm going to keep using it until somebody comes up with a better idea. So it's not unreasonable to use your own stuff. But it just means you want to think about how confident we might be that that survey is a good survey for tapping into students' attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions. Another thing I want you to think about. What does it mean? They said down here when they were describing this, asking participants to rate their level of agreement with 30 positively and negatively keyed statements. What does that mean? Positively and negatively keyed statements. And why would you want to do that? What do you think?
Because they're all like positive type questions. You might not, like, there could be somebody who feels negatively toward it, and you're not going to necessarily know how negatively they feel toward it if they're all phrased in a positive manner.
If you get a survey and all the questions are framed in a... Now, let's think about the context in which this survey was administered. How did it get administered to students?
And then
Last 2 weeks of class, okay. What else?
after the professor is already gone.
So the professor leaves, who stays? Research assistant stays. Do we know if it's a graduate research assistant or undergraduate research assistant? No, we don't know. Okay. But the research assistant stays and gives the students a survey and says, what do you think?
Answer honestly.
Answer honestly. And it's full of questions about the class and how you feel about it. Questions like, writing about research is something I like to do. I have a good feeling towards statistics. Most research ideas and principles aren't very useful. Now, if you got a survey like that, let's just say you went to lab and Yuri said, here's a survey, Dr. Darnell wants you to fill it out at the end of the semester. How would you feel about it? How honest would you be?
I mean, are we going to see you again after?
Oh, see, it's the last 2 weeks of the semester, so you have to imagine that, yeah, you might come see me, you might have questions about your final paper, you might have questions about your final exam.
But I'm sure they didn't.
Okay, so it was probably anonymized, right, so students didn't put their names on it, but still, I mean, if you've done lots of projects with a teacher, this class only has 25 students, and you handwrite your answers. Anybody in here have distinctive handwriting?
Distinctly bad.
Distinctively bad. Okay, so how confident would you be? I mean, okay, I would like to think that you trust me if I said I'm not going to consider this at all until after the semester is over. I'm going to look at it. We're just gathering data to find out how you felt about the class. It's totally anonymous, blah, blah, blah. What's the likelihood that you would really seriously read every single question thoughtfully and do that internal reflection you need to rate each question on a scale of 1 to 7 in a genuine, thoughtful way?
Probably not 30. That's a lot of questions. Like, it'd be thrown at you at the end, like, oh, by the way, here's a 30 question here.
Okay, so what do you think? I mean, just put yourself in their shoes.
I can't remember, did they know that they were going to get this questionnaire at the end of class? I don't remember reading that, like whether or not they knew they were part of the study.
Probably not.
Okay.
Because you don't necessarily, you might not want students to know.
Just so you can get the most.
Because if they know they're part of a study, what might happen? Huh?
Prepare themselves?
Well, I mean,
They
we
might
hope they're going to
try to-
prepare themselves anyway because it's a class and they're getting a grade in it, so
They might try to answer the questions the way you think.
what do we call that?
I forgot the word. What are they called? What's it called? Confirmation? No, conformity bias? No.
Okay, so that there might be some kind of demand characteristics or subject reactivity, right, where they say or do what they think you want to hear as the professor, right? Or maybe they're like, oh, I really want the research to come out well, so I'm going to answer it in the way that I think it's supposed to be, right? So they've got this survey with 30 questions on it that students get, and while it's challenging to imagine many other ways you could get this kind of data, we also have to recognize that with self-report measures, there's some potential for the answers to not necessarily be accurate, right? So I want you to think about as you're evaluating the validity of this measure for their attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions. To what extent we can trust the answers the students gave. Not because they're intentionally being dishonest, but because students are motivated by a lot of things at the end of the semester. One may be, I'm hungry, and I don't want to answer 30 questions. So I'm just going to do what? 5, 5, 5, 4, 5, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, smiley face, done. Have you ever answered, I mean, you can imagine that happening, right? You ever just wanted to leave class and you could have stayed maybe for a little bit longer, but you're like, yeah, no, I don't care anymore. I need to go use the bathroom. Sometimes that's why you leave, right? Maybe in retrospect you might wish you had made a different decision, but sometimes you're like, yeah, I'm just doing it. So we want to think about that. Now about those positively and negatively key questions, if you take a look at these examples, do you get an idea what that might be about? Are all the questions going to have a positive tone or all of them a negative tone? Why not? Why might it not be good to have all the questions phrased in a positive way?
Well, if there was a student that did the 4-5-4-5 thing, then it would, if you have some that are negative, where when you're measuring if they had a positive perception, then they would choose, if they were all positive questions and they had a positive perception, it would all be at the other end of the spectrum. But if you mix it up, then students who are just picking random numbers.
Right, so it's a way for us to check that students are actually responding to the question and not just picking a number and circling it. But this is true for any kind of self-report. It's handy when you're asking about attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions to switch the tone of the question so that in some cases, so say you believe that statistics is good or useful. Okay? So it might be one question where I say, to what extent do you agree with the statement, I think statistics are useful for everyone. Right? Then you would select strongly agree. But you want another question that says, I don't think statistics are useful for most people. Well, the same person probably wouldn't say strongly agree then, right? They'd say disagree or strongly disagree. And so you look for cases like that. You have questions like that in the survey itself so that you can check to see if your respondents are actually factually reading and answering the questions, or if they're just doing 5, 5, 4, 5, 5, 5, 4, 5, 5, 5, 5. Yes, I can leave and go use the restroom. Because that's not good data. Does that make sense? So when you're asking about attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs, it's really useful to switch the questions in terms of their tone or direction so that you can kind of check whether or not people seem to be responding in a reasonable pattern or whether they seem to just be picking one end of the scale.
What's the term for that? Is there a term for that?
When you're having some kind of selective response, or they're actually not. I'm trying to think, what is the right term for that?
We talked about my sociology class too last semester.
I think there probably is a term for that, but I don't use surveys very much, so off the top of my head, it's not a term that I can think of. I would just describe it. But I'll look and see. If you can find it, post to the discussion board. That would be good. Yes?
If you notice somebody's just doing random answers like 4, 5, 4, 5, and not answering accurately, would that be data that you just leave out?
Right, so it allows, if you find evidence that something like that is going on, then you could set a standard that says, questions were evaluated for consistency of response on similar topics, and if there was evidence that more than 2 questions had been responded to in completely opposite ways to suggest that the student wasn't actually reading and responding to the question, then those surveys were omitted. So you can come up with a standard that allows you to use that information to eliminate them, but you have to report that.
Roughly.
Now, I don't think they reported dropping anybody out, right? So the suggestion is that they didn't find any evidence that that was an issue, or they didn't use it that way. But that's what I would do. But you have to be careful about that. Okay, so they used lots of Likert scales. They varied a little bit. So one was, was on an agreement, and then another one down here was about, went from not at all to definitely, which I don't know how that's so different, but that's how they did it, so, okay. How do you think, so given all those caveats now, you have to make a decision, an assessment of how good their dependent variables were measured. Do you have an idea in your head? Whether it was great, really strong, or really weak? Probably not either of those things. Probably not perfect. Probably not horrible. Somewhere in the middle. But you've got some evidence you could go with either way to kind of justify your mental assessment. Does anybody have any questions about that? Do you have a sense now about construct validity, where you might go? Yes? Silence. All right. Next is statistical validity. What's statistical validity about?
The extent to which the results are appropriate.
Okay, so there are the statistical results
Or reasonable.
Reasonable, real, right? So did they do the right test for the data that they had? Did they get results that we think reflect what would happen in the real world, right? Truly, are these real findings? Or do we think that their significant results might be type 1 error, or might reflect type 1 error, and their non-significant results might reflect type 2 error? So how do we figure that kind of stuff out? How do you make a judgment call? First of all, how would you decide whether they did the right test or not?
What test they did.
Okay, what tests did they do? They did t-tests. Lots of t-tests. Did they do, is a t-test the right test to do under these circumstances? You think so? Why do you think so? There's only one independent variable, and what else?
2 plus.
Only 2 levels, right? Experimental and control. So if you have one independent variable and 2 levels, what kind of test do we do? T-test. So it seems like they did the appropriate test. That's good. They used the appropriate statistical test for these data. Now, what might we do to evaluate how good or how valid we think their statistical findings are? What kind of things do we consider? What kind of things contribute to getting a significant result or not getting a significant result? Effect size, right? We might look at effect size. What else might we think about? Probability. What was their criteria, right, for getting a significant result? What else? Sample size, right? Sample size. So when you think about when we do a statistical test, we care about the sample size, we care about the alpha, and we care about whether it's the right test. And then we're interested in finding out the size of the treatment effect. How big of an impact did that independent variable have on the dependent variable? All right? So if we take as a measure of effect size this R value here, and this is a little bit different than R squared, but for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to treat it like R squared. Okay? So I'm going to let you evaluate it and think about it as R squared for the purposes of this exercise. So let's take a look at the effect sizes. What kind of effect size is that? Which one? Someone said small, someone said large.
Large.
Large. Okay. So we have a large treatment effect. What about this one? Medium? Even you're doing upward intonation today. Medium? Okay, what about this one? Small. Okay, now we get some downward intonation. All right, here we go. Okay, so you can look at these and have a sense of effect size. Okay. So what would you expect then? Where would you expect to get statistically significant results, and where would you expect to get non-statistically significant results?
More significant for the large.
Okay, so we would expect to get a significant result where we had large effect, and the smaller the treatment effect gets, the less likely we are to get a statistically significant result, right? Because effect size is telling us about how influential the independent variable is in changing the dependent variable. How much does it matter? So, how do I know if something is statistically significant here? Where do I look? T, that's going to be their observed value. No, you're not just kidding. That's part of it. But what else do I need to know? I can't know whether that's significant unless I had a critical value to compare it to. And I guess you could look it up because they give you degrees of freedom, right? So you could look it up if you needed to. But do you have to look it up to know whether it's significant or not?
No.
Where could you look on that table? Do you think they wouldn't tell you?
There was like
An asterisk by it.
Okay, they could put an asterisk, but there's not one here. So where else could you look? If I told you there is information in this table which would give you a clue, What's the most common alpha in psychology research?
0.05.
Okay.
Oh, and they're all to 2 decimal points.
0.05. So where would you look to see if something was a smaller value than 0.05?
P-value.
The p-value. That's right. That's the p-value. So they're actually telling you what their statistical analysis revealed for the actual probability of getting that score. So if this p-value is less than 0.05, that's a significant result. So which results are significant up here? Is this one the first one? Is this significant?
No.
Is
Oh,
0.024 less than 0.05? And so the probability of getting this is further out in the tail than that set alpha value. So this is in the critical region. So is that significant?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, this one is statistically significant. So there was a significant difference in reports of APA-style efficacy for the two groups. How would you know which group thought that they were better at using APA style? How could you tell? Where would you look? The means. Okay. Remember, these scores are given on a 7-point scale, where a 7 is high, good, 1 is low, bad. Right? So if we're looking up here, we see that the control group, that's the standard treatment control group, right, where they just did reading, lecture, and test kind of thing. Their average score was 6.14 on that question about APA style efficacy, and the experimental group score was 6.5. And apparently, that difference was enough to result in a statistically significant outcome. So we can say that there was an effect of instructional condition on students' perceptions of APA-style efficacy, such that students in the experimental group felt that they had more APA-style efficacy than students in the control group. Does that make sense? Do you see that? Now let's take a look at this next one. What about research attitudes? Was that one significant? Was that significant? Because their p-value was 0.2, and that is not less than 0.05. So that was not significant. There's not a significant difference between these two. And that seems kind of weird, doesn't it? I mean, let's think about that for a second. Why would it be that this difference, which is like less than half a point, that's a significant difference, but this one, which looks like about the same amount, is totally not?
Was that on
Why?
one of the different scales, maybe?
They're all on 7-point scales.
Oh, okay.
So why would that be? I mean, this one is 0.27, that one's 0.15, so this one's medium, but this one is not different. Why might that be? Should our alarm bells be going off? Should we be thinking, hey, there could be something wrong here. This might be type 2 error. Maybe.
The standard deviations are a lot higher.
That's right. Here's the trick. The standard deviations are more than twice, meaning there was a lot more variability in how people responded here. So the averages might look like they're about the same distance apart, but people were much more consistent up here when it came to APA-style efficacy than they were when they were talking about their attitudes about research. So we also have to keep in mind how much variability was there in the scores. That's going to influence whether or not we get a significant result. Because this is kind of gives you some idea, almost like, how similar are these scores? I mean, this says 3.61 is the average, but it could also be up to 1.38 higher, right? And that would overlap with 4.03. So these aren't super different from each other. They're not different enough to be significant. What about research skills and abilities? Was that significant?
No.
No. And let's look at the effect size. Tiny. So are we surprised? No. We wouldn't expect that to be significant given that the effect size is so small. Okay, so you should be able to work through this and have some opinion about whether these make sense. Let's talk about sample size for a second. How big were the samples? How many students were in the control condition and how many students were in the experimental condition?
33 and 37.
33 and 37. In general, sample sizes of 30 or more are thought to be adequate for getting a normal distribution. So if you've got 30 people in your sample, that's a good kind of low end for getting a normal distribution, which is important because you want your sample to be normally distributed. So is their sample size adequate? Yeah. Okay, so we don't have to worry that maybe the sample size was so small that they missed some findings because they just didn't have enough power. They have 30 or more than 30 people in each case. Were the samples really different in terms of size, 33 and 37? Is that really different? No. So it's not like we had one group that had 10 and one group that had 40. Then we'd have to worry that there was some bias in the statistic, right, with power, statistical power. So we're feeling, think about now how you're feeling, what you're thinking about the statistical validity. Have you got some ideas in your head about what to consider with regard to that? Yeah? Okay. Now let's talk about internal validity. How do we feel about the internal validity? And why? What's internal validity about?
Alternative explanation.
Hmm?
Alternative explanation.
Alternative explanations for what?
For results.
For the results. Okay, so are there reasons other than instructional condition that could explain why the students in those two conditions responded as they did? So what do you think?
I thought it was weird that one section was done in spring and one was done in fall versus like two. Yeah, like or running them simultaneously, like in the same.
Okay, that's certainly a difference. So that's something that they did not hold constant. Okay, so that's a potential, I mean, that's certainly an extraneous variable, like the semester that the course was offered. That's an extraneous variable. Now, why might that matter? Why would it matter if one group of students took the class in the spring and another group of students took the class in the fall? How are spring classes and fall classes different?
It's more likely to be people graduating in a spring class versus a fall class.
Okay, why would that matter?
Senioritis.
Senioritis. Okay, so the spring class could have had more students who were getting ready to graduate, who were just wanted to get the class done, didn't really care. So they might have had different attitudes about because it's all about attitude, right? Mm-hmm. And senioritis is about attitude. Your brain, what happens to your brain? Shuts down. You're like, I don't know, but I'm thinking it's going to be like this. Anybody graduating this semester? Next semester? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so as you get closer and closer to graduation, how much do you care about your classes and how much are you caring about just getting done? Okay, so spring students might be more focused on ending the school year than on doing well in class. Okay, what else? How might taking a class in spring and class in fall be different?
It's the time of year. Like spring is right before, even if you're not graduating, like it's right before, if you don't take summer classes, that big long break. So you can be a little bit more anxious to
And spring break.
end the school year.
Everyone's kind of just ready to be done, right? Whether you're graduating or not. Okay, that makes sense. Here's one I'll throw out from the last class. I thought was a really insightful idea. So this class has a prerequisite, right? When do you think people in the spring took the prerequisite, most likely? In the fall. So how much time was there between when they took the prerequisite and when they took this class?
None.
Well, not none.
Like
but
a month.
maybe a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks in between fall semester and spring semester. Okay, now, people in the fall semester, when do you think they took the prerequisite?
2 semesters ago.
Maybe spring, or maybe like, they could have taken it.
They could have taken it in the summer. You never know.
Could have been.
But it's more likely they took it.
But it seems likely that they could have taken it in the previous full semester, which would have been in the spring, which means how much time was there in between when they took the other class and when they took this class? 3 months, maybe. So that might contribute to their attitudes and stuff too, right? They might already find it harder, or they might, who knows? But there's something, that's a potential difference that could influence their attitudes, right? If it's been a longer time since they took the prerequisite. That could influence how you feel about the class, or how useful you think it is, or how much help you need to refresh your memory about facts. Okay? What else? What other extraneous variables were not controlled, or were controlled? What things did they hold constant? What things did they do a good job of making the same, so that that wouldn't be an alternative explanation?
The groups are a decent size, like they're.
The groups are about the same size, okay, so we don't have to worry about that. What else?
Age was pretty, I mean, there's a bigger range, but the average was.
The average age of the students was pretty consistent, okay? What else? Let's take a look at this. Year in school, is that pretty consistent? We actually know from the results section where they talk about student characteristics across the 2 semesters, right? No significant differences between the 2 semesters in terms of age, whether they worked in a lab. Okay? So in terms of their practical hands-on experience working in a lab, there was a significant difference in terms of gender distribution, such that there were more males in the spring or the control semester and more females in the fall and experimental semester. Now, why might that matter, if at all? Why might it matter?
There are theories about different learning styles among genders, so
Okay.
maybe one condition may have worked better for the gender or something.
Okay, so maybe males might respond better to one teaching strategy than females. That's possible. So it could be that potential difference could have skewed the results somehow. What's the stereotype about men, women, and math? Men are better at math. Women are better at writing. Right? Something like that. So could it be that maybe some of the attitudes about those things could be related to their preconceived notions about how good they should be at the topic anyway? That could be. We think about men and women and comparing them. Which group do you think is more likely to say something nice?
Women.
Women are more likely to say something nice? The guys are like, wait, well, you're being quiet, you better speak up there. The guys are like, well, maybe. There's 3 guys here today. Oh my gosh, it's like it's a takeover. All 3 guys are here today. The 2 from the back aren't here, the other 2 aren't here. But we got 3 of the 5 representing today. So, but which is more likely to say something nice? Probably women, more likely if you asked them, so how do you feel? What do you think? Did you like it? Do you think we did a good job? Women might be more likely to say something more positive, right? Especially if they like the professor.
It's not a stereotype, though.
Well, but we don't, stereotypes are sometimes based on reality, right? So
Well,
if
it's like
the,
you said the other day, women are conditioned to possibly say things nicer.
women are encouraged to be nicer, and it's an artifact of being physically smaller in many cases than men. It's a higher risk for us to be threatening and aggressive.
You're also seen as being like caregivers, but
That's right, women are caregivers, and here's the thing, if a guy is assertive, you know, if a guy is aggressive, he's assertive. If a woman's aggressive, she's bossy, right? So there's just different ideas about, so you might, I'm imagining that this could be an issue. So for example, since the survey is all about, you know, you're agreeing or disagreeing with how much you know, how good you feel about this, and is it possible that female respondents gave more positive answers because they're just likely to give more positive answers about everything? Because women are encouraged to be positive. Because if they're negative, they're bossy, or bitchy, or difficult. Where men are assertive and confident and strong. Right? Now again, you're right, we're totally talking about stereotypes, but
They don't come from nowhere.
stereotypes don't come from nowhere, right? So it's possible when you're talking about something like this that could potentially be an influence, so you want to think about it. Doesn't mean you're going to decide it's the main issue. You might say, yeah, you know, I don't think that probably was that much of an issue here. That's fine. That's totally your call. But if you think it's possible that it could be important, then I just want to raise it as an issue, right? We're talking about attitudes, beliefs, perceptions.
you can also look at men in psychology classes. They're going to be on the other spectrum from other men.
Okay? So men who are taking psychology might be more positive and caring and supportive because they are in a female-dominated field. So maybe the men are going to be more positive. You guys are positive guys in this environment where you're a minority. Right? Men aren't often in a situation where they're a sex minority in a learning environment, especially not one that involves math. So these guys might be very positive, good, you know, nurturing, caring guys who might be, and so you've got more of them in the control condition. They might have been answering more positively about that experience than they would have otherwise. Good point. Nice observation.
I'm a nanny, so.
That's right. He's like, oh, you want to talk caring professions? I got you covered. You're right. Okay? So you're exactly right. But there's a reason why that intersection works for you, right? Okay, so just these are issues why that sex difference might matter. What things the instructors were the same, right? You think the instructors were the same? That's a good thing, right? If you had the same instructors across the 2 semesters. That being said, did you notice when you start to think about internal validity, a great place to look to see, to get some ideas, is to look at the section of the discussion where they talk about the limitations. Because limitations of a study are basically where the authors are fessing up to potential alternative explanations for their findings, or potential threats to their interpretation. So what kind of things do they talk about here?
They said they pointed out random assignment, and then they also said the instructors might have been more enthusiastic about the new.
Right. So even though, although there were multiple professors each semester of data collection, the instructors might have had more enthusiasm or given more effort in teaching the new approach with the experimental group as compared to the control group, right? Doing something new. If you've been doing your job the same way for a long time and then you get a chance to try something new and you're kind of invested, you want it to work, right? Because if you're going to put all this effort in to do something new, you kind of want it not to fall apart and be a big catastrophe. So you might try a little harder. And if your professor is more enthusiastic and excited, you feel like your professor's really trying to make the experience a good one for you, how do you feel?
Rubs off.
It rubs off, right? But if you feel like the professor's up there just going through the motions, and you've all had professors like that, right? Hopefully you don't feel that this is that situation, right? But if you've had professors who you felt like were just kind of, here's the PowerPoint that is exactly the same as the book, and I'm reading the PowerPoint to you in a voice like this, and we're doing the same activities that I've done.
Somebody specific?
Huh?
Or
I'm not thinking of someone specific. I mean, I can say that, for example, I know that one time I was asked to cover a class for another faculty member, and that faculty member had been around for a long time, and that person presented me with handwritten lecture notes that had been in his filing cabinet for years, and he was using the same lecture notes. He probably had the same handwritten lecture notes that he was reading from in class for 5 years or 10 years, because he was teaching intro. And those were his notes for intro. And he handed me these handwritten notes, and I'm like, I'm going to have PowerPoint. We're going to be doing some this. And he's just like, no, I'd like you to do it. I'm just like, how do I do this? Like, I don't know how to just stand up there and read, because that's what he did. He would get up there and read his handwritten notes, and he expected students to write the stuff down. And I'm just like,
No PowerPoints?
no PowerPoints. No videos. I mean, this is a long time ago. I'd only been here a couple of years. We were still using transparencies.
oh my God.
I know. It's practically the dinosaur age, right? I think the Petite Center was actually still the county jail. Because on that land used to be, when I first got here, was the jail. County jail was right there. Then they leveled it, and it was just a big dirt lot for a long time. But so it's been a while. I've been here a long time. But I'm just saying, there are professors' enthusiasm can rub off, and that works both ways, right? If the professor is clearly not very excited or seems like they're going through the motions, then you kind of just go through the motions as a student, right? If you feel like the professor is engaged and excited and trying to make things work for you, then you might be more likely to try and be engaged and excited and try to make things work for them. Right? Kind of like a contract, social contract. So that's a good point. Okay. So you want to take a look and see what kind of things they're talking about. I mean, they admit straight up, we couldn't do random assignments. And in pedagogical studies, ethically, it's quite difficult to do that when you're talking about teaching. Right? I mean, it's not, we talked before about why randomly assigning students to an instructional condition is problematic. Especially, you don't get to say, okay, you're going to take the class with this person. What if you don't want to take it with that person? What if you don't want to take it at that time? What if the assignment you get is really bad for you? Doesn't work for you? And you end up getting a worse grade because of it. So ethically, we just typically don't randomly assign students in pedagogical studies. That's just the thing that we don't do. And, we say it's common and unavoidable given the nature of the study. And it was the same problem, they had the same problem in the previous study.
So in the census paper, since it's unavoidable and unethical to do that,
it just means it's not something you want to hold against them too much because it's the nature of the beast.
Right, so I'm saying, is it something we still have to mention?
Well, it does threaten the internal validity of the study, but it may be a threat that's unavoidable.
Gotcha.
And sometimes that happens. Sometimes you don't have the best choices to make. Sometimes you have to make a choice that's not awesome, but you do the best you can. So what did they do? And we can think about the two groups of researchers that were examining for this paper. They made different choices about how to deal with that issue. Right? One group did all of their stuff in the same semester, so they held semester constant but had different instructors for each condition. This study used different semesters but had the same instructors for the two conditions. Which do you think is a better choice? Two different ways to do it. Which do you think works out better? Is it more important to take the class, to have all your data being gathered in one semester, or is it more important to have the professors be the same? Does that make sense? I mean, these are just different choices you could make. So one of your jobs is to say, well, so these two studies made these researchers made different choices about how to deal with this common and unavoidable issue. And maybe you think one choice is better than another, so take that side and go with it.
So I should mention that it's a threat, but also say that it's something to the effect that it's unavoidable.
It's unavoidable, but you might personally believe and be ready to argue that one solution is better than another solution. You might think that given that the study is about instruction, having different instructors across the conditions represents a greater threat than having the courses take place across different semesters, for example. Who knows? But that's just one possible way you can look at it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Anything else you can think of related to internal validity?
Question.
Yeah.
Would it not be possible for the same instructor to teach the same course just two different ways in one semester?
It could be possible, yes.
Would that just be unfair, I guess, too?
Well, it wouldn't be unfair in that the control group is still getting the standard treatment, right? Which is what they would otherwise get. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that from a professional standpoint, teaching the same class different ways the same semester is kind of confusing. It's harder to keep your head about what you're doing clear. So you wouldn't want to, like, say you were doing this at the same semester. Okay? Say I was doing it at the same semester. And I teach multiple sections of this class all the time. So it would be weird to do one class where, okay, we're doing these papers, we're doing this other stuff, we're doing these projects, and then the class it's like, okay, today we're going to lecture, and we're going to do this thing, and it, to keep them separate and to not have bleed over, to not say, because I'll come in here and I'll say, oh, so in my other class somebody asked this question. Because the classes, we take video in this class that students in my other class look at, right? So for me, it's kind of like having two breakout sessions of a similar class, right? Same class. It's easier to do it that way because I can come in and talk with a different group of students about similar stuff in a similar way. But switching it up might result in more bleed over so that the two conditions weren't as clearly defined. And that might threaten the construct validity. Does that work? Make sense? So, certainly you could do it. Another possibility, another thing they might try, is they could have added another independent variable. They could have counterbalanced it, and they could have had half the professors do it the new way in the spring and half of them do the old way in the spring, and then switch it and have them do old way in the fall and new in the fall, right? So they could have thrown in another variable, counterbalanced it, and then seen if there was any difference. So there's an alternative. There's a way they might have played that if they had enough instructors to do it. However, that probably would have threatened the sample size if they ended up getting an effect. If they had an interaction, then the samples would be a lot smaller, and that could be a problem for statistics. So again, it's all cost benefit, right? Yeah, there's lots of things we could do, but what's the cost of making that choice? And doing it this way, at least they were able to say everybody in the control condition did it at the same time. And everybody who was teaching that semester was teaching the same way. We're holding these things constant, trying not to create more variability. But in another context with more teachers, like here, we teach 12 to 16 sections of 35-30 in a given semester. We might very well switch it up. In fact, there are studies that happen where we'll have hybrid classes and non-hybrid classes, and one semester someone will teach their class the traditional face-to-face way only, and the other time they'll teach it in a hybrid way, and they'll have other people who are doing it in the opposite order, and then they'll analyze their data to see if there's differences in how students respond to them teaching the different courses. So it can happen. It's just harder to do. This is a mid-sized school, right? They just might not have enough sections of the class to do something on that scale. But at a place like Georgia State, we might be able to pull something like that off. Okay, what about the external validity? how well do you think this study would generalize to other settings?
It's a private university, so it could be different.
This is a medium-sized private liberal arts university in the Northeast. Who do you think their students might be? Maybe more conservative. Who goes to private universities? People with more money, right? So maybe higher socioeconomic status. Maybe not everybody, but you might have a larger proportion of students from higher socioeconomic groups than people who attend a large research-oriented state university, right?
They didn't do a racial ethnic background.
They did. They don't report anything about the racial or ethnic breakdown of their students. Why do you think that's true? Why do you think so?
It's not that diverse.
Huh?
It might not be that diverse.
There might not be too much diversity to report. So one possibility is that we're talking about a private liberal arts school in the Northeast, it's in New Jersey, I think. So it might be that the school is really, really, really representative of one group and not of many others. So there isn't really any diversity to report. Another possibility is that diversity, they may think that the diversity issue isn't relevant. For example, do you think that someone's racial or ethnic identity would interact with their ability to respond to one or the other of these teaching scenarios? Do you think that that's an issue? Do you expect people from different racial and ethnic groups to respond differently to these different teaching conditions?
No, but that's making assumptions.
That's right. It's making assumptions, right? And are all racial and ethnic groups equally distributed across socioeconomic groups? No. So if this school has a disproportionate number of high socioeconomic, medium to high socioeconomic students, they may have had very different educational experiences prior to getting there than students who are attending large public schools or come from lower socioeconomic groups, right? What if they've been going to private schools the whole time? You think they're used to having small classes and all these engaging activities and extra field trips and new stuff? As compared to what if they've been involved in a large public school system with limited resources, where there's a lot of focus on passing those standardized tests. A group might respond better to one situation than the other just because it's more familiar, more comfortable. It's what they think school's about. Do you think all teachers are able to do this? Could all teachers pull off this scaffolding technique? Do you think they'd all be comparably good at it? We were talking about how much training professors get sometimes to be teachers. Did you know that sometimes the orientation for faculty when you start to give them training for teaching is less than 1 day? The assumption is that if you have a PhD, that means you're good at learning, so you're probably good at teaching.
It's not a good assumption.
Well, I would say that's increasingly true. But for a long time, that has been the assumption. If you are a good researcher, then you are a good teacher. And if you can do research, doing research is what getting a PhD is about. So if you're a good researcher, you're probably a good teacher, because clearly you know a lot about it, so you can teach well. but that's not necessarily the case, right? So there might be some teachers who would be good at designing this complex scaffolding and pulling it off, and others who might not be so good at it. I mean, have you encountered people with PhDs who aren't great teachers? Is that, huh?
They're like socially awkward sometimes.
Yeah, you
I've had,
know.
like, social
You're
stuff.
You're right.
A lot of it has to do with experience.
Could have to do with experience, but it could also have to do with habit. If you have somebody who's been teaching from the same lecture notes for 30 years, and then you tell them they got to get up there and do all this scaffolding and writing and all this other stuff, they might be like, "You did what? No, that's not how it works.
These are my handwritten notes.
I'm a sage on the stage, right? They're supposed to write down what I say. I'm not here to entertain them. This is not television. They are here to benefit from the wealth of my wisdom. I'm not here to engage them. Let them engage themselves. If they care, they'll get themselves engaged. That's not my job. Have you ever had a professor like that? Yeah. We all have, right? So it's not clear that this would generalize across all types of university instructors, right? It might take particular instructors who are engaged themselves in pedagogical innovation or teaching innovation. Yeah.
This is probably going back to the confounds, but it says in demographics that they inquired about age, sex, and academic standing, but they never reported. I didn't see any numbers about the academic standing.
I think their academic standing is referring to whether they're freshmen, sophomores, juniors, or seniors, not their grades.
Okay.
Well, there you go. You can. But yeah, I think you're wondering like, how good students are they?
Yeah, because that was something I was like, oh, they did that, and they didn't know it.
Okay. So do you have ideas you can work with? Are you already in your head seeing some similarities and differences, thinking how, which study did each thing better? Do you have a preference already of which study you think was better put together, better executed? You don't have to yet. You might not have gotten there yet. You might have to work through it some more in your head first. But you do have to have a conclusion that brings one study out as being superior to the other, and your essay should back that up. So I don't want any wishy-washy conclusions. Well, they were both good, and they both had their strengths, and they both had their weaknesses. No. I want you to have an opinion.
You don't have classes next week, right?
You do not have classes. Next week is consultation. That's correct. And in case you weren't here last time and don't know, the paper is due when?
Tuesday.
Tuesday. That's right. You have an extension. It's not due tomorrow. Your critique paper is due Tuesday at 11 o'clock.
And then this is rough draft review the day after the
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
For the introduction, we're getting for 8 minutes, and how long?
The introduction before you start getting into the validity bits?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would not make it, you're probably thinking, probably not shorter than 1/3 of a page, but probably not longer than 2/3 of a page. You should start your discussion of validity. It should probably be at least 1/3 of the first page. If you're talking about a 2-page paper, right? We're talking about the critique paper or the synthesis paper?